Okay, we'll see how this goes. Today I'm going to record a lecture on religious development, and to do that, I've got to talk some about developmental. Now, if you weren't in my intro class, in intro I talk a lot about operant conditioning, and this is all about pain and pleasure, and so it's based on consequences. And so as we grow up as little kids, we have these different consequences. And if you haven't seen this before, Thorndike in 1911 came up with this thing called the law of effect. What he would do is put cats, and I don't know if you can see this little cat over here, but he would put cats in puzzle boxes, and if they would repeat certain sets of behaviors, I think about video games, then they would get out of the box. So this would lead to pleasure. But if they didn't repeat certain, if they repeated other sets of behaviors, they would get punished, so they would avoid those patterns. And so just like that in life, we have these contingency patterns in which we're either rewarded or punished for doing certain things, and then we have a memory of that, and so we either approach or avoid certain things. So this has a lot to do with all development, but especially the development of religious thought. Okay, so I have on here, and now you can't see these four things, the fourth one anyway, but the fourth one is pretty easy. You have positive and negative reinforcement, and so I can encourage certain behaviors. That's why it's desired. Positive reinforcement, I give you a reward every time you make your bed. Or negative reinforcement, which is kind of weird. You're already in a state of pain, but then if you do the right thing, you get out of that state of pain. So you'll repeat that set of behaviors really fast. My example of this is the seatbelt buzzer in your car. As soon as I get in, I have an amp in my car, so mine's really loud. I'll do anything it takes to get that sound off. So do the correct behavior, click it, and then the buzzer goes off. Now down here, for bad behaviors, I can either punish you, like hit you, give you pain, which is not always the best thing, but it happens. Or the last one that you can't see is omission training. Omission. I omit something, I leave it out, I ground you, I take away your phone. So in these four tools, I usually say are the tools that parents use. Because parents, like B.F. Skinner talked a lot about shaping. He thought he could take clay and shape it into anything, just like any human being. Like if I grew up in China, I wouldn't talk like a redneck, right? Or even if I grew up in the Bronx, that we could shape all these different attributes of Tim. And it's kind of a radical idea that you don't really have a personality. It's all shaping based on consequences. Now, parents use this because they have complete control over you when you're young. And so even if they don't hit you, they can ground you or praise you and do these different things that shape your behavior in certain ways. And so with religion, it depends upon if you grew up in a religious household, that they start to shape your mind and reward certain behaviors and kind of discourage or punish other behaviors. And so just like clay, you can't see this little thing down here is good, but they can shape your behavior. So in class, sometimes I argue, and I'm not in class with you right now, is your religion just randomly determined by where you grew up? Like I sit here and spout off about Jesus all the time because I grew up here, but if I grew up in Saudi Arabia, I bet you I would be spouting off about the Quran and Muhammad all the time just as much. And so it might just be a spin of the wheel where you grow up determines what religion you are. Okay, so this is an idea from Sigmund Freud that has a lot to do with how our minds get shaped. What he said is when you're a child, you have a lot of must, like you must brush your teeth, must make your bed, must go to school. But then after a while, you kind of get brainwashed with that. And then when you grow up, I should be one to talk. You have this parent within your head that says, you know, I ought to make my bed. I ought to do this. I ought to take out the trash. And so the oughts are really the voices, the echoes of our parents in our head. Calls this process introjection, that you incorporate the attitudes or these like things your parents have told you into your subconscious, and you think that they're really yours, but really they're the echoes of your parents and probably their parents' parents. I really love this idea because in a way parents help develop your ego. We talk about the id, ego, superego, and like over time, you know what I mean, they give you these little ought, must, and then it turns into ought, and that's where our super ego comes in. It's like, you know, I ought to not do that. Why? Because I got punished for it at one time, but got the echo of the punishment in my head. I don't know if that makes sense, but I really love this term introjection. Okay, a lot of times, kids like that are real young will say, "Oh, I'm a Democrat or Republican," and why? It's like, well, maybe because their parents kind of have subconsciously, trained that into their head. Okay, so I want to get into cognitive development, and when I talk about that, I'm just going to talk about I don't know if you had me for intro, but if you didn't, Piaget, Jean Piaget, there's other people after him, of course, but he's, kind of the front runner or the forefather of all this, developmental work as far as cognitive development goes. And he has these 4 stages. For this class, I'm going to focus on stage 3 and 4. I'm going to briefly go through each one of them and highlight a few things, but not as much detail as I do in my intro class. I hope this makes sense. So for sensory motor, this is when you're a little bitty baby. You don't have to know these age ranges, but in the sensory motor stage, you learn about, of course, senses and sensory input. So let me see if I can use my pen right here. And you also start to learn there's a boundary between you and the external world. The two things are different. Now, Alan Watts talks a lot about this, like you can't separate yourself from the external world. And so this is why I like, teaching about this, especially within a religious context. And then eventually you start using motor skills, so sensory motor. I can use my avatar, my body. I'm trapped in this avatar, but I can use it. And so I have this thread on here because it goes back to the tapestry trip. It's like, oh, look, I'm a different thread than everybody else. Yeah, at some point you have to disconnect. Ram Dass talks about this, but find your way back home into the tapestry. Okay, so hopefully I didn't confuse the issue there. Just keep in mind, this is for little bitty babies, and for this class, they don't understand religion. They can barely understand that they're even a human. Okay, but pre-operational is where we come in next. And in pre-operational, um, the kids are maybe in this age range, sorry about that, and they start to use words and images to represent the external world. And so here's where you get simplistic, representation. I could get into language and talk about, that language are just symbols for these things we interact with, but I don't want to go that deep. But one of the things I focus a lot in on is schemas. Schemas are these mental folders, and so like ant, bug, cat, these would be like schemas, and then some of them grouped together, like horse and goat might go onto a farm together, and so I would have a farm schema. I don't want to go off on that, but from intro class, this is where you're starting to barely understand the world. And from a religious perspective, you still barely understand cats and bugs, much less God, Allah, whatever, Brahman, these concepts. So schemas, I have it right on here, is a mental category or folder, mental folder. So we have these mental folders. In my gender class, I talk a lot about it because we have the boy and the girl folder. And then if we get into transgender people and genderqueer, then the folders become an. Now, suppose like I'm a little kid and have a dog folder, then maybe I start calling everything a dog. And so this is what he called assimilation. I just assimilate everything into the folder I already have. But as I grow up, I start to get other folders, cats and dogs, and assimilate everything. Okay, so finally, the 2 stages that are most relevant for this class. The first one is concrete operations. Focus on this word. Concrete means literal. If I can spell right, it's like literal. So you get really logical. This is where I call kids little scientists. Why? Tell me why this works. And so they want to know how things work, but they're very, very literal. I have it down here. I didn't know. And so their schemas get, of course, more sophisticated. They don't call everything a dog. They know what ferrets are or other animals. And so maybe they even get this sophisticated eventually as we grow up, right? Because if you're in biology, you have, a system of animals and how they're, categorized and grouped within certain schema. So formal, last one. Hopefully I'm doing a good job, but formal, I don't know why they call it formal, but this one focuses on abstract thinking. So it's not literal, it's not black and white. It's kind of like if then, well, I wonder if this happens, then this would lead to that. They can figure things out in their mind. A lot of times on video games, you can formulate, well, what's going to happen if I go around this corner? And you can like make hypotheses about that. The other thing is they start to understand symbolic meaning, and for this class it's huge. I usually talk about, like, I don't know if I have them on here. Oh yeah, Shrek. whenever Shrek rolls up to Lord Farquaad's house, he's talking to Donkey, and right on a kid's movie, he says, "Wow, what a big castle he has," and then goes on to say something like, "Yeah, he must be compensating for something." And so he makes a penis envy joke right on the movie, and so kids in this stage will giggle because they know the joke is dirty. Kids in the previous stage will giggle because they just think Shrek is silly. And so now they get a deeper understanding, if I'm making sense right here, because in concrete operations, you're literal. Think about the Bible or the Quran and things like that. In formal operations, you get the deeper meaning. Think about the parables I've told you about Jesus or other people, Buddha. They go into these deeper hidden meanings. Even the Tao Te Ching has all this symbolic meaning within it. Okay, I hope that previous excerpt made sense. I'm going to go into detail a little bit more about Piaget because I really think the developmental stage your brain is caught into as a little bitty child all the way up into an adult has a lot to do with how you see religion. And so a lot of times when it comes to formation, forming little kids' minds, there's a lot of that clay shaping that goes on that Piaget was talking about and also Skinner was talking about before, I should say. Okay, so Tammany in 1991 asked little kids, third graders, and I think third grade is a little bit different in Finland, but still they were little kids to finish the sentence. I think prayer is. I could do this with adults, and here's how most people finish the sentence. I think prayer is asking God for something, and this is what I call the Santa Claus God. So, God, just give me a new car, give me a wife, give me this, give me that, get me out of a jam. And so, just like the saying that soldiers say, there are no atheists in foxholes. Just get me out of here and I'll do whatever you want me to, right? And so that's a more childish view of God because you're just seeing God as like Big Daddy. And we talked about this with Sigmund Freud. Now, if I come back here and hopefully my pen is going to work, if I do it this way, I want to focus in on these two stages right here because here's literal and here's deeper meaning. Now here is like, gobbledygook, and here, little baby, you can't even talk. And so really 3 and 4 are the most essential things for the test. So are you going to be literal right here, or are you going to be more symbolic? And I really think if you think about all the great spiritual teachers, I'm just going to focus in on Jesus. When he talks about the parable of the sower, he's not talking about seeds. He's talking about the word and where does it land, right? And so it's a symbolic, understanding of the word instead of a literal. Now, Jean Piaget started the ball rolling. He would give these little kids 2 scenarios. In one scenario, John spills 15 cups of coffee. In another scenario, Henry spills only 1 cup. Now, he asked little kids and older kids, who's worse in a moral sense? And younger children say John, because see, look, John spilled a whole lot more. But older kids say, it was Henry because it was intentional. He meant to do it. So they have a deeper understanding of who's at fault just in these little moral scenarios. And so besides this, Ham back in the 40s, and I know this is an old study, but just had children draw their conception of God. And they also interviewed them about their conception of God. And so he kind of broke people into 3 stages, which kind of goes along with stage 2, 3, and 4 from Piaget, because stage 1, you're a baby, so we can just throw that one out. So from 3 to 6 years old, which is basically Piaget stage 2, right here would be, he called it fairy tale stage, because they just said God is the same as the creatures from the fairy tale. It could be like the Easter Bunny. You know what I mean? God is, or Santa Claus. It's on the same level as that. That's their understanding of God. And you see this with little kids. But kids in the middle get in this literal, realistic. So this would be like literal, concrete, right? What I've talked about before. And that God and angels are like people with superhuman traits. We still all kind of have that. I get caught in that. But older kids kind of had this more abstract conception of God, like God is energy, and how am I going to draw energy? It's like kind of, if God is this cosmic energy that binds the Holy, well, I can't draw that. And so they had a harder time drawing God. And so here, once again, you had pre-operational kind of from Piaget. This is like concrete. And then this third one over here, that would be like the formal operational where you get this abstract. See, literal abstract, same thing. Okay, so Goldman in the 60s did some of the same things. One of the problems I have though is like he had a real low sample size, only 10 boys and 10 girls here. But he interviewed them regarding pictures in Bible scripture. And so one of the scriptures he focused in on was Exodus 3. And so in this scripture, this is when Moses goes up, I think. Yeah, Moses goes up and then he sees the burning bush and he hides his face. And they ask the kids, what is all this hiding his face about when he sees the burning bush and he thinks it's God? Why does he hide his face? And so this is why, I'll have it over here. Why was Moses afraid to look at God, is what it says. And here's the three stages. Okay, pre-operational, right from Piaget, because God had a funny face. Okay, so this doesn't make any sense. It's silly. Okay, so I just call this silly. Now you get to the concrete operational, because it's a ball of fire and it might burn you, or if you look at it, it might blind you. That's commonsensical, right? And then finally, let me see if I can get a different color pen. And the formal operational is like, oh, God is holy and I'm sinful, so I can't just look at God, or God is too awesome and almighty, and like maybe Moses, I don't know. That's kind of old theology I don't like, but you can see there's a deeper understanding from older kids. Okay, so what's the wrap up from this whole section? I'm fixing to put a big bow on it. Basically, if you go back to Piaget, little kids don't have any understanding of God because they just have this vague, like God is like the Easter bunny and he's silly, he has a funny face. But these are the two sections for the test. Oops, I can't even draw a star right. And this one right here, concrete versus abstract. It's like if Jesus starts talking about the ravens in the field, is he just talking about birds? Or the man with the build of the bigger barn, is he talking about barns? Or is he talking about something deeper? You know what I mean? And the same thing within other, the Tao Te Ching or within the Quran, there has to be deeper meanings that are hidden underneath this. This is why I like Carl Jung, but I don't want to go back there right now. So that's where you get this abstract thinking, and that's the one I think that most people should be at. So some Okay, sorry, the phone rang and then I was fixing to finish the lecture up. So here we go. Sometimes I assign this movie for extra credit. I don't even know if you can watch it anymore, but it's a very disturbing movie because they take these little bitty kids and they're forming, brainwashing them. And basically what my idea is do they really understand when they're giving their life to Christ? Are they at really a vague level? Oops, I tried the pen. That vague level we talked about, are they more at a concrete level where they go, okay, I think Jesus is like just a superhuman? Or are they really at a more abstract level where they understand, the word? And I would argue they're not here. I don't think they're here, you know what I mean? And that's what's disturbing about it. But you could have a different take on it and completely argue against me. But this is an interesting take because it really, as we start to form little kids, how fast do we make them give their life to Christ if they don't really abstractly understand what the word is all about?